This is the point where the old timeline stops responding to you. Not dramatically, not with collapse, but with silence. If you are hearing this now, it is because something you used to rely on no longer pulls you forward the way it once did. The motivations that used to work feel hollow. The reactions that once felt automatic feel delayed or absent. And that is not confusion. That is separation beginning. Timelines do not end when everything falls apart. They end when the internal agreement that sustained them quietly expires. And yours has. You are not lost. You are unhooked. And that distinction matters more than you realize. Because when a timeline can no longer extract energy from your attention, it cannot carry you further. It simply stops updating. This is why things may feel slower, quieter, or oddly neutral lately, as if life is waiting for something you cannot name. It is waiting for you to stop trying to move forward, using structures that no longer recognize your frequency. The discomfort you feel is not fear. It is incompatibility. And incompatibility is irreversible once it is conscious. This message is not here to rush you or excite you. It is here to mark a threshold. Because past this point, effort does not work the same, attachment does not behave the same, and identity itself begins to loosen. And once that loosening begins, the old timeline cannot follow you, no matter how familiar it feels. What most people never realize is that timelines are not carried forward by events, opportunities, or even decisions, but by internal posture. The old timeline you lived inside was sustained by a specific orientation toward reality, a way of relating to effort, identity, fear, desire, and time itself. It functioned because you needed it to function. It responded because you fed it attention, urgency, explanation, and emotional charge. But that posture has shifted, and when posture shifts, structure follows. This is why the old timeline cannot accompany you further. Not because it is bad, wrong, or broken, but because it is no longer structurally compatible with who you are becoming. You are no longer organized around proving, enduring, waiting, or compensating. You may still recognize those impulses, but they no longer fully engage you. And a timeline cannot persist on partial engagement. It requires coherence. The old one had coherence once. It does not now. That is why you may feel moments where you try to re-enter old patterns only to find that they do not grab you anymore. The emotional payoff is gone. The narrative no longer convinces. The effort feels strangely ineffective. This is not resistance. It is misalignment. And misalignment is mechanical, not personal. A timeline built on survival cannot host a consciousness that has begun to stabilize beyond survival. A structure built on urgency cannot support a nervous system that has tasted stillness. A narrative built on becoming cannot continue once being begins to take precedence. This is why separation feels quiet rather than dramatic. Nothing needs to explode because nothing is wrong. The system is simply conserving coherence. And coherence always chooses the path of least distortion. The old timeline would require you to compress yourself again, to re-adopt reactions you have outgrown, to re-enter loops you can now see clearly. That compression would create internal noise, friction, and fatigue. The system avoids that by withdrawing responsiveness. This is why doors may feel half open, relationships feel unresolved without conflict, ambitions feel suspended without collapse. The timeline is not resisting you, it is releasing you. And this release often brings guilt, because the mind interprets non-participation as failure or avoidance. But what is actually occurring is graduation. You are no longer energetically eligible for certain dynamics. Not because you are above them, but because you are no longer shaped by them. Eligibility is not moral, it is vibrational. And vibration here does not mean mood or positivity, it means organization. You are organized differently now. Your attention does not fragment as easily. Your reactions do not escalate as automatically. Your tolerance for distortion has decreased not because you are fragile, but because you are precise. Precision cannot function inside imprecise systems for long. And the old timeline was imprecise by necessity. It was designed for learning through repetition, contrast, and friction. You learned what you needed there. And now that learning has integrated, the repetition no longer adds information, so it stops. This is also why trying to go back feels strangely exhausting. Even when you attempt familiar behaviors, something inside you resists, not with force, but with a lack of energy. Motivation drains quickly. Excitement does not sustain. This is the system preventing regression, not punishing curiosity. Awareness has changed the physics. Once perception reorganizes, old incentives lose their leverage. And this can feel destabilizing if your sense of self was tied to those incentives. But the destabilization is temporary. It is the space between structures, a liminal zone where the old has lost authority and the new has not yet fully crystallized. And in that zone, patience becomes essential. Not passive patience, but intelligent restraint. Because forcing forward motion from the old posture will only recreate fragments of the old timeline inside the new one, creating distortion. The reason this message arrives now is because you are capable of not doing that. You are capable of letting the separation complete without dramatizing it, without narrating it into fear or urgency. The old timeline cannot follow you, because it would have to be rebuilt to do so, and rebuilding would require you to re-identify with what you have already outgrown. That option may still appear superficially, but it will not satisfy. And satisfaction is the metric the system uses now. Not pleasure, not success, but resonance. If something does not resonate, it cannot remain. This is not a choice you must strain to make. It has already been made structurally. Your role is simply to stop negotiating with what no longer responds. Because the more cleanly you release the old timeline, the less turbulence accompanies the emergence of the new. What makes this phase difficult is not what is happening, but how unfamiliar it feels to experience change without chaos. Most people are conditioned to associate transformation with crisis, loss, or dramatic rupture. So when a timeline dissolves quietly, the mind searches for something to blame, something to fix, or something to reclaim. This is where the sensation of loss arises, even though nothing tangible has been taken from you. What you are feeling is not grief for people, opportunities, or identities themselves, but for the orientation they once gave you. The old timeline told you who you were by contrast. It gave you friction to push against, problems to solve, goals to chase. And when that framework loosens, there can be a strange emptiness, not because life is less meaningful, but because meaning is no longer being generated through struggle. And the nervous system, accustomed to effort-based validation, may interpret this neutrality as absence. But neutrality is not absence. It is space. Space that has not yet been filled with a new structure of coherence. This is why this phase often feels isolating. Not because you are separate from others, but because you are no longer synchronized with the emotional tempo of the old timeline. Conversations may feel repetitive, social dynamics may feel loud or performative. Even your own thoughts may feel less compelling. And in that quiet, the mind may ask, "What is wrong with me?" When the more accurate question is, "What am I no longer feeding?" The feeling of loss comes from the withdrawal of emotional hooks that once organized your attention. You are no longer oriented around anticipation, reaction, or resolution in the same way. And without those hooks, identity briefly floats. This is not an identity crisis. It is an identity pause. A necessary suspension that allows essence to come forward without being immediately shaped into narrative. Many people attempt to escape this pause by reattaching to familiar loops, reactivating old desires, or amplifying drama to feel grounded again. That grounding is artificial and short-lived because it conflicts with the new internal organization taking place. The system will not allow sustained engagement with what no longer fits. So attempts to recreate the old timeline feel hollow, draining, or strangely unsatisfying. And this can create anxiety if you interpret satisfaction as a measure of worth or direction. But satisfaction here is not about enjoyment. It is about alignment. You are not meant to feel entertained by this phase. You are meant to feel recalibrated. And recalibration often feels like detachment before it feels like clarity. This is also why isolation may increase temporarily, not because you are meant to withdraw permanently, but because resonance reorganizes before it reconnects. Old connections were formed around shared loops, shared urgency, shared identity structures. When those dissolve, connection pauses until new alignment becomes visible. And this pause can feel lonely if you mistake connection for proximity. But true connection is resonance, not constant interaction. And resonance cannot form while the signal is still stabilizing. This is why the system creates space, not as punishment, but as protection. Protection from prematurely locking into new roles, new explanations, or new commitments before coherence has fully settled. And during this phase, the mind may attempt to label the experience as regression, stagnation, or avoidance because it lacks familiar markers of progress. But progress here is internal and structural, not visible or performative. You are learning how to exist without leaning on friction, without needing problems to feel alive, without needing urgency to feel relevant. That learning requires quiet. And quiet can feel threatening to an identity built around movement, improvement, or contribution. But this quiet is not emptiness, it is incubation. And incubation always precedes emergence. The loss you feel is not something being removed from your life, but something no longer being required to hold you together. And when something is no longer required, its absence can feel destabilizing at first. But what replaces it is not another attachment. It is stability itself. A stability that does not depend on contrast or validation. And once that stability anchors, the feeling of loss dissolves, replaced by a grounded sense of self that does not need to be constantly defined. This is why this phase cannot be rushed or bypassed. It is the psychological decompression that allows the new timeline to form without inheriting distortions from the old. And the more you allow this detachment without narrating it into fear, the more smoothly the transition completes. There comes a point in every timeline transition where choice no longer operates the way it used to. Earlier, decisions felt active, deliberate, even dramatic, as if each turn required effort and justification. But past a certain threshold, choice becomes passive, almost invisible, because awareness has already altered the range of what is possible. This is the point of no return, not because something external blocks your way back, but because perception itself has changed. Once you see how a pattern functions, you cannot fully participate in it again. You may attempt to reenact it, but it will feel staged, incomplete, like repeating a script after the meaning has drained out of it. This is why the old timeline cannot be re-entered with sincerity. The emotional logic that sustained it no longer convinces your system. And sincerity is required for any timeline to function. Without it, engagement becomes mechanical and quickly collapses. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening and believe they have lost motivation, passion, or purpose. But what has actually dissolved is compulsion. You are no longer compelled to react, pursue, or defend in the same way, and compulsion was a primary engine of the old timeline. Without it, the old structures cannot generate momentum. This can feel unsettling because compulsion often masquerades as drive. But drive that is rooted in fear, lack, or identity maintenance cannot survive awareness. Awareness exposes the cost. And once the cost is visible, the system naturally withdraws. This is the irreversible shift. You cannot unknow the trade-offs you once accepted unconsciously. You cannot return to chasing outcomes that no longer feel clean. You cannot fully inhabit roles that require you to shrink or perform. And while the mind may fantasize about returning to familiar certainty, the body will not cooperate. Energy will not mobilize. Intuition will resist. Timing will falter. This is not sabotage. It is protection. Protection from rebuilding a structure that would immediately fracture under your current coherence. The point of no return is not marked by confidence or clarity. Often it is marked by doubt and hesitation, not because you are unsure of what is true, but because you are learning to operate without force, and force was once your primary tool. Letting go of force feels like losing control, when in reality it is gaining precision. Precision does not rush. It waits for alignment. And this waiting can feel like stagnation if you are still measuring movement by output. But output is no longer the metric. Integrity is. Integrity between what you sense, what you choose, and what you act upon. And that integrity makes certain actions impossible. You may notice that you cannot lie to yourself the way you used to. You cannot justify staying in misaligned situations. You cannot ignore subtle discomforts without consequences. These are not restrictions. They are refinements. The system is narrowing your path, not to trap you, but to protect coherence. And this narrowing is what makes return impossible. The old timeline required tolerance for distortion. It required you to override intuition, rationalize discomfort, and delay honesty. You no longer possess that tolerance. And without tolerance, the structure collapses. This is why fear often spikes here. Fear not of the unknown, but of the known becoming inaccessible. The comfort of familiar struggle, familiar identity, familiar problems may call to you. But comfort is not compatibility. And compatibility is what governs timelines. The old one is no longer compatible. You have already crossed that line. Even if part of you resists, the deeper system has decided. And this is not a decision you need to affirm or announce. It is already operating. Your role now is to stop negotiating with the past out of nostalgia or fear. Because negotiation drains energy and delays stabilization. The faster you accept that return is not required, the faster the system reallocates resources toward what comes next. And what comes next does not reveal itself through urgency or planning. It reveals itself through responsiveness, through noticing what feels clean, what feels timely, what feels quietly correct. And that responsiveness is only available once you stop trying to reopen doors that no longer respond. Moving forward from this point does not require effort in the way effort once defined progress. The old timeline rewarded force, persistence, explanation, and repetition. The new one does not. It responds to coherence, and coherence is not something you chase or construct. It is something you stop interrupting. This is why the final phase of this transition feels deceptively simple. There are no dramatic instructions, no declarations, no need to sever the past or announce the future. What is required now is restraint. Restraint from feeding what no longer responds. Restraint from narrating uncertainty into fear. Restraint from trying to translate this shift into language before it has fully stabilized. Because premature interpretation is one of the few ways distortion can still enter at this stage. The system is precise now. It listens closely to what you reinforce with attention. So integration becomes an act of subtraction rather than addition. You remove excess reaction. You remove unnecessary urgency. You remove the impulse to prove that something is happening. And as those are removed, the new timeline begins to assemble itself quietly around you. This assembly does not feel like acceleration. It feels like alignment. Things meet you where you are instead of requiring you to chase them. Timing improves without effort. Decisions clarify without pressure. And what once required constant management begins to self-organize. This is how you know you are no longer dragging the past with you. The weight is gone. But so is the adrenaline. And that can feel unfamiliar if intensity was once your signal of aliveness. You may notice that your energy becomes more selective, not withdrawn, but precise. You engage fully where resonance exists and disengage cleanly where it does not, without justification or drama. This is not avoidance. It is boundary as a natural property of clarity. And these boundaries stabilize the new timeline more than any action ever could, because boundaries conserve coherence. And coherence is the fuel now. This is also why silence becomes important. Not as isolation, but as calibration. Silence allows subtle signals to register. Signals that would be drowned out by constant input, explanation, or social mirroring. You may find yourself speaking less, posting less, reacting less, not because you have nothing to say, but because what matters does not require constant articulation. And articulation too early can fragment something that is still integrating. Trust that what needs to move will move when structure is ready. You do not need to push. Pushing would imply mistrust, and mistrust is incompatible with the timeline you are entering. This new orientation requires a different relationship with time. Time is no longer something to outrun or optimize. It becomes a collaborator. You act when timing feels clean. You pause when it does not, and you stop forcing continuity where cycles have already ended. This may look like stillness to others, but stillness is active here. Timing improves without effort. Decisions clarify without pressure. And what once required constant management begins to self-organize. This is how you know you are no longer dragging the past with you. The weight is gone. But so is the adrenaline. And that can feel unfamiliar if intensity was once your signal of aliveness. You may notice that your energy becomes more selective. Not withdrawn, but precise. You engage fully where resonance exists and disengage cleanly where it does not, without justification or drama. This is not avoidance. It is boundary as a natural property of clarity. And these boundaries stabilize the new timeline more than any action ever could, because boundaries conserve coherence. And coherence is the fuel now. This is also why silence becomes important. Not as isolation, but as calibration. Silence allows subtle signals to register. Signals that would be drowned out by constant input, explanation, or social mirroring. You may find yourself speaking less, posting less, reacting less, not because you have nothing to say, but because what matters does not require constant articulation. And articulation too early can fragment something that is still integrating. Trust that what needs to move will move when structure is ready. You do not need to push. Pushing would imply mistrust, and mistrust is incompatible with the timeline you are entering. This new orientation requires a different relationship with time. Time is no longer something to outrun or optimize. It becomes a collaborator. You act when timing feels clean. You pause when it does not, and you stop forcing continuity where cycles have already ended. This may look like stillness to others, but stillness is active here.